100 years ago, an influenza pandemic spread around the globe at an alarming rate. Estimates vary on the exact number of deaths caused by the disease, but it is thought to have infected a third of the world's population and killed at least 50 million people, making it the deadliest pandemic in modern history. Although at the time it gained the nickname Spanish flu, it's unlikely that the virus originated in Spain. The outbreak began in spring of 1918, in the final months of the First World War, and historians believe that the conflict may have been partly responsible for spreading the virus. On the Western Front, soldiers living in cramped, dirty and damp conditions became ill. This was a direct result of weakened immune system from malnourishment. Their illnesses were infectious and spread among the ranks. Within around 3 days of becoming ill, many soldiers would start to feel better, but not all would make it. During the summer of 1918, as troops began to return home on leave, they brought with them the undetected virus that made them ill. The virus spread across cities, towns and villages in the soldiers' home countries. Many of those infected, both soldiers and civilians, did not recover rapidly. The virus was hardest on young adults between the ages of 20 and 40 who had previously been healthy. In 2014, a new theory about the origin of the virus suggested that it first emerged in China, National Geographic reported. Previously undiscovered records linked the flu to the transportation of Chinese laborers, the Chinese Labor Corps, across Canada in 1917 and 1918. The laborers were mostly farm workers from remote parts of rural China. They spent 6 days in sealed train containers as they were transported across the country before heading to France. There, they were required to dig trenches, unload trains, lay tracks, build roads, and repair damaged tanks. In all, over 90,000 workers were mobilized to the Western Front. Historians believe this was likely a result of wartime censorship. To maintain morale, World War I censors minimized early reports of illness and mortality in Germany, United Kingdom, France, and the United States. Spain was a neutral nation during the war and did not enforce strict censorship of its press, which could therefore freely publish early accounts of the illness. As a result, people falsely believed the illness was specific to Spain, and the name Spanish flu stuck. Initial symptoms of the illness included a sore head and tiredness, followed by a dry hacking cough, a loss of appetite, stomach problems, and then, on the second day, excessive sweating. Next, the illness could affect the respiratory organs, and pneumonia could develop. The indications were clear. They sound familiar, don't they? By the summer of 1918, the virus was quickly spreading to the other countries in mainland Europe. All public places were closed. Reported cases of Spanish flu dropped off over the summer of 1918, and there was a hope at the beginning of August that the virus had run its course. In retrospect, it was only the calm before the storm. Somewhere in Europe, a mutated strain of the Spanish flu virus had emerged that had the power to kill a perfectly healthy young man or woman within 24 hours of showing the first signs of infection. In late August 1918, military ships departed at the English port city of Plymouth, carrying troops unknowingly infected with this new, far deadlier strain of Spanish flu. As these ships arrived in cities like Brest in France, Boston in the United States, and Freetown in West Africa, the second wave of the global pandemic began. From September through November of 1918, the death rate from the Spanish flu skyrocketed. In the United States alone, almost 200,000 Americans died just in the month of October. Some people believe that the rapid spread of the Spanish flu in the fall of 1918 was at least partially to blame on public health officials unwillingly to impose quarantine during wartime. In Britain, for example, a government official named Arthur Newson knew very well that a strict civilian lockdown was the best way to fight the spread of the highly contagious disease. but he wouldn't risk crippling the war effort by keeping munition factory workers and other useful people at home. By December 1918, the deadly second wave of the Spanish flu had finally passed, but the pandemic was far from over. A third wave erupted in Australia in January 1919 and eventually worked its way back to Europe and the United States. The mortality rate of the third wave was just as high as the second, but the end of the war in November 1918 removed the conditions that allowed the disease to spread so far and so quickly. The pandemic mostly killed young adults. Between 1918 and 1919, 90% of the pandemic influenza deaths in the US affected people under 65, and nearly half of deaths were in young adults between 20 and 40 years old. This was very unusual, since influenza is typically mostly deadly to the weak individuals, such as infants under age 2 and adults over age 17. One of the theories is that older adults may have had partial protection caused by exposure to the 1889 and 1890 flu pandemic known as the Russian flu. One explanation for the rapid decline in the lethality of the disease is that doctors became more effective in prevention and treatment of the pneumonia that developed after the victims has contracted the virus. Another theory holds that the 1918 virus mutated extremely rapidly to a less lethal strain. This is a common occurrence with influenza viruses. There is a tendency for pathogenic viruses to become less lethal with time, as the hosts of more dangerous strains tend to die out. The outbreak coincided with the deaths and media focus of the First World War. Another explanation involves the age group affected by the disease. The majority of fatalities from both the war and the epidemic were among young adults. The number of war-related deaths of young adults may have overshadowed the deaths caused by the flu. When people read the obituaries, they saw the war or post-war deaths and the deaths from the influenza side by side. Particularly in Europe, where the war still was high, the flu may not have had a tremendous psychological impact, or may have seemed an extension of the war's tragedies. We should be aware that demographically in 1918 our population was more rural, and it was easier for people to isolate themselves. Now, in 2020, our population is more urban, and it is therefore more difficult for us to be more isolated. Let us be hopeful and full of prayer that the latest coronavirus will not be as devastating as the Spanish flu was and will be over soon. But keep in mind that the COVID-19 marks the return of a very old and familiar enemy. Throughout the history, nothing has killed more human beings than the viruses, bacteria, and parasites. Not natural disasters like earthquakes or volcanoes. Not even wars, because the virus is an invisible enemy, and it can be much harder to defeat.